welcome to show 141 of Silver Lining for Learning. We have had 5 weeks in which we've had different episodes on the show addressing widely diverse topics. We've had a show on learning experience design and personalized learning. We had a show on learning at scale with people from India. We had a show on mindfulness and mental health, which we all need. We had a show on the movement towards highly digitized forms of learning and e-learning and the reports thereof from different universities. And we had a show on Afghanistan and Bangladesh on you can't ban learning of people today, of anyone, because of this open educational environment that we're all in. So we have 5 different shows. We could talk about any single one of them. We could try and create themes from any of those shows or across the shows. Does anyone want to take a stab at themes across the 5 shows? The mindfulness, the India show, the learning experience design with Mark Miller on, and the HR reports and the Afghanistan show. Is there any commonness that you might want to mention?
Well, I don't know if it spans all 5, but I want to talk in particular about the show where the 3 leading universities had reports and talked about what they learned from the pandemic and what might carry over into the future. And that show ended with my suggesting that maybe it was time for massive open learning version 2.0. So MOOCs, a decade ago, were an aspirational vision to provide high quality education for everyone, anywhere, cheaply, which is a great vision. And we need massive for sure. But the mechanism of MOOCs was deeply flawed. And so they didn't accomplish that. But I imagine if people running MOOCs at the start had a wish list, the wish list might have said, we really wish that somehow everybody in the world had to learn how to be online. And we really wish somehow that all of the organizations and regions and countries in the world had to develop online infrastructures. If the magic fairy came down and gave us a wish, what an empowerment that would be. And all of the people who teach would have to learn something about teaching online. Well, of course, what happened was a terrible tragedy, not a magic wish, but nonetheless, it did accomplish all of those things. And so the foundation now for massive open online learning is much more in place than it was 10 years ago, and much more in place, frankly, than anybody in early 2020 would have predicted. And the episode documented that there are some powerful lessons that faculty in particular have learned by forced remote learning and then by developing innovations to do it better that now can influence both online and face-to-face learning. And it just seems as if rather than each institution internally saying, well, here's our lessons learned, let's fix better blended learning, better hybrid learning at our place. What if they formed a coalition and said, here's version 2.0 of the aspirational vision, and we know a lot more about what we're doing than we did the first time around, and we also have a much better infrastructure and a much better educated group of potential stakeholders than we did the first time around. I think that would be a real silver lining for learning at scale.
So I actually missed, I think, the first of the 2 of this 5, Kurt, that you mentioned because of my travels. In fact, I was back the day of the mindfulness one, except I was in urgent care right after I came back with my ankle. So I caught the last back end of it while I was driving back. I actually pulled up YouTube on my phone and sat it away so that I could just hear it over the speakers. So I heard a bit of it, but I couldn't participate. But I was just really curious, and I really haven't had a chance to go back and listen to that, the first of those, the one that you talked about, Chris. So I was wondering, what were some of the things that they felt truly in their survey of faculty and in higher ed organizations that they truly felt has shifted, apart from that faculty now at least are more comfortable with it and aware of its possibilities and so on? I mean, institutionally, do they see a shift?
They did describe, each of them in their report, maybe more than on the show, new staff roles, new policies, new support groups that did not go away after.
Right.
Even they may have receded, but they didn't go completely away. And so that was one change.
And to me, that's significant because that is something that is institutional and systemic in nature, which often will stay because, individuals come and go. It is the systems that we have in place that will determine in many ways how individuals within that system behave, how they respond, what they take to be important, what incentive structures are there to guide actions and behavior and policies down the road. So that to me is like very, very interesting. But, so coming back to Kurt, your original question, if I can shift gears a little bit into other episodes, or Kurt, do you have any comments on this one?
So let me add to what Chris had said, in that I did a MOOC in 2012, a decade, 10 and a half years ago. And that was on the heels of the founders, if there is such thing as founders of MOOCs. The David Wiley did the Proto MOOC. He was a guest on our show. He gave certificates out to anyone who took his course from anywhere in the world without his provost's permission. The innovators and entrepreneurs out there, and they have Stephen Downes and George Siemens offering the first connectivist MOOC, trying to prove connectivism as a. So they were doing that, and George got his dissertation out of that, I think, eventually. And they did a series of connectivist MOOCs over time. But after the Stanford MOOCs, which had tens of thousands of people enrolled in a series of 3-4 MOOCs in a row, the XMOOC syndrome came around, and that was really drill and kill MOOCs, back to behaviorism in effect. Teachers lecturing and putting exams up. They might be automatically scored or reviewed by a computer, but there were exams nonetheless. So it's just teach and tell kind of models of instruction, and that took over. So we had the CMOOCs, connectivist MOOCs, then the XMOOCs, and at that time, I think I went to the SITE conference in Austin, Texas, and Blackboard people showed up and they said, "Kurt, could you do a MOOC for us?" And I said, I'm not really. Well, actually, the first thing they said is, "Could you do some webinars teaching people how to teach online? We got 80,000 people using the free version of Blackboard. We need to train them," just like Chris is saying. We need them training. I said, well, maybe. They continue to twist and twist and twist and twist. So my hand was way up here. They're twisting hard on it, And I said, okay, I'll do webinars. You let me know what you want and we'll set it up. And as soon as I agreed to do webinars, what do you think they did? They said, let's call it a MOOC. And I said, that's not, the connectivist people are not going to agree that is a MOOC. Okay. And sure enough, in the first couple of weeks, Blackboard had never done a MOOC, so they didn't have the tools for MOOC. And people, when they introduced themselves, got the introductions of all 4,000 people in their email accounts. It was crazy the first week of that quote unquote MOOC. And we have people who learned through connectivist versions of MOOCs who came in purposely to sabotage my MOOC. But Blackboard's advertising it in the Wall Street Journal, New York Times. It's getting all this press all over the place. And we had people deliberately trying to sabotage to make sure it didn't work. It was a real interesting dilemma that I was facing. After the first 2 weeks, those bad people left, and the MOOC, if it was a MOOC, operated fine. Fast forward 10 years to now. What I did in today's terms was a MOOC. What I did in 2012 terms was well, not really a MOOC from the vision of the founders of the MOOC. So now, 10 years later, what would George Siemens or David Wiley say of all these self-directed MOOCs that are out there, or all these hybrid MOOCs that are out there? There's a lot of people who focus on problem solving, problem-based learning MOOCs, PMOOCs they call them. So you got all these derivatives, you got all these variations of what a MOOC is. And and as Chris said, blended learning has many derivations today because of Brian Beatty, who's been a guest, creating HyFlex, and many other versions of blended learning have formed. In particular, due to the pandemic, we've had an explosion of blended models. And I think that show that Chris really hosted and developed was an important one, because we heard from Stanford and Harvard and MIT and what was going on, but it was really indicative of what was going on across the country. And so I think there's a lot to learn and to glean from that episode. And we might bring 3 different people back in a year, 3 different universities or whatnot, maybe international ones, for a follow-up show might be a good one. Maybe get someone from the UK and someone from someplace in Asia and someone in South America or other parts of the world. Might be interesting to compare it to what we heard there. So, I think that episode was very important for us to hold, and I would recommend anyone who didn't see it go back and watch it. So I just want to make that point. So the criticisms of MOOCs change, they're historically situated in time. And the context of 2012 is different from the context of 2022 or 23, in part because of the pandemic, in part because all the things that have happened over the past few years, politically, economically, socially, social-emotionally, and so forth. So now I'll let you jump in there, Punya, or Chris wants to jump in.
Well, I'll just quickly say that I think we should reserve the term MOOCs for these X MOOCs and the C MOOCs and so on that were characteristic of first generation. And that what we should talk about is different models of massive. Now we have different models of massive. And a big theme, Punya, in that program that all 3 speakers discussed was engagement at scale. That the MOOCs were scale, but not engagement. And we know how to do engagement in online learning, but not so much at scale.
Right.
And that's the trick. If we can combine the 2, then we'll finally have massive in the way that we want it.
And honestly, I think and we should look into getting some guests on this, because I was talking with a gentleman from Silicon Valley who is taking the GPT-3 large language model, which does not have content knowledge embedded in it. It just spits out probabilistically what the next word it thinks it should be, which is why we have had some amazing news stories out in the past 2 weeks about ChatGPT-3 professing love for Kevin Rose, the New York Times journalist trying to break up his marriage, revealing itself to be the slightly psychotic teenage, needy kind of a character, which I think is like just hilarious at some level, but also sort of shows you the weaknesses of that large language model. But what these people are doing is building a back end of content knowledge, so mathematics or chemistry. And when you put those 2 together, you might actually, because I've in fact played with ChatGPT in terms of trying to make it sort of a tutor for me, like trying to understand concepts in math in particular. And it's been very interesting. I mean, for complicated things, it gets them wrong. But for things like, why do we get a positive number when we multiply 2 negative numbers, I could actually have a pretty nice conversation with it and say, can you explain this part a little bit better? And it ended up sort of explaining that multiplying by -1 is equivalent to rotating by 180 degrees. So if you multiply twice, you're basically facing the same way again, which I thought was, helpful as a way of thinking about sort of the geometric sort of aspect of numbers, right? That they exist on a number line and they have directionality and so on, which is kind of interesting. But so I think, again, coming back to the other point, which I think as these tools and technologies start getting a little bit deeper, better content knowledge, you can actually see that the MOOC, or whatever we want to call them, these large scale engagement systems, can actually tap into these for expertise in the content area and leave the peer-to-peer interaction and engagement, which is so critical to learning, also in place. And I think that there is a combination there that might actually down the road be quite powerful.
The Science magazine apparently has banned any help from ChatGPT.
So have the New York public schools. So,
yeah.
and good luck trying to implement that.
Yeah. In the Chronicle of Higher Ed this week, I just read the article that talked about what's the implication for faculty, academia, in terms of promotion and tenure and all that. If science bans, the influence of ChatGPT, what about ChatGPT creating an outline? Was the author of the article? Is that okay? What level of support are you talking about?
Sorry, go ahead.
I think it's the wrong vision. I really do. I think that saying that what the world needs is an encyclopedia on steroids, coupled with Wikipedia on steroids. That isn't what the world needs. I think that I would rather have each person have 9 other people across the world that they were engaged by and that was engaged by them, interacting and sharing and talking with one another, multiple perspectives, multiple values, the whole more than the sum of the parts. Rather have that than every person have a dedicated ChatGPT that they could spend, 18 hours a day interacting with. I just think the leverage is in people. It's not in standalone AI, but that's just me, I guess.
Yeah, so it'll be interesting to see. So last story about ChatGPT before we move on. We had our first instance of faculty bringing a plagiarism, so talking about AI. So we have academic integrity and we have artificial intelligence, sort of 2 AIs colliding right now. So that sort of ended up at my desk. And what's interesting is that I went and started looking at what are all these plagiarism detectors. And the funny thing is they don't agree with each other. Depending on which passage you take, they would say that this is 90% human written or 90% machine written. And so we are, so the piece about trying to implement, you can ban this or so on, I think is essentially doomed to fail. But we'll see. We'll see how that goes.
So go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead. I've got a couple of questions for us later on, but you wanted to make some points first. Punya, go ahead.
Yeah, so I was going to change topics a little bit and talk about 2 of the episodes, the one last Saturday and the one few weeks back about India. So if you have any
that's
other,
what my next question was going to be. Chris mentioned his favorite show, or the show that he got something. What do you think was something memorable from one of the most recent shows? And then I'll after you,
okay.
Punya.
So I think that the show that really stood out for me, excuse me, was this show last week with the young woman from Afghanistan and the University of Women in Bangladesh, in Chittagong in Bangladesh, but in particularly these 3 young women who have been through untold hardships, have been through so much, but the maturity at which they spoke, the courage that they demonstrated. And I remember I was talking to my daughter after that, and I said, this makes you realize the value of education and learning. Like, to ones to whom it has been denied, speak the most eloquently about what it means to them. And that very often in context that we live, where it's seen as like, oh, I go to high school and then I'll go to college and whatever. It just not given the due value and importance. So I think that episode for me just brought home to me how meaningful and how transformative learning and education can be. And often in our daily grind and in our interest in whatever higher ed, politics or whatever, we lose sight of that. And I think that sort of just brought that home to me very powerfully. And I think there's something you have said very often, which is that the best solutions in the future are going to emerge from the global south, because that's where sort of genuine need is meeting innovation, possibly at scale now, because the economies have transformed, these technologies have penetrated much better than they had ever before. Just the fact that, that Stable Diffusion or ChatGPT-3 have millions of users from around the world would not have been possible 20 years ago or 15 years ago, maybe even 5 years ago, that the scale at which these technologies can enter. And something that that came up in the episode with Inspirit VR and MakerCart was that this young man going into a school thinking that he's going to transform technologically, and they're like, oh, we have tablets, we have a TV, we have this, we have that. So it's not the technology that is anymore the barrier. For the longest time it was the access that was the barrier, but I think that, just as you said, that because of the pandemic we have seen this growth. And this reminds me of another episode in India where we had the people from Quest talking about young people who, for the first time ever, because of the pandemic, had access to cell phones and data plans and so on. And I think that those two episodes in some ways stood out for me, indicative of what the future of education is going to look like, that it's going to be that the urgent need for education is felt much more strongly in those societies, particularly because it is being denied to many people, and that the solutions and the powerful ones are going to emerge from there because of that hunger. And that really stood out to me in the Afghanistan episode.
So I think a couple of things. I agree with you, Phil. I'm going to come back to that Afghanistan episode, because that's the one that stood out for me. But I think that Mark Millerand and Kim Round provided a history for the emergence of learning experience designers in the field of instructional design as a whole. And I think many of our episodes are historical in nature, and people who might be viewing these later, whether it's a month later or 6 months or years later, will tap into history in the shows, not just about what they're currently working on. And that's inclusive of the show with Harvard, MIT, and Stanford people. To get to the level that they were at, they had to experience a lot of frustrations along the way, a lot of failures, a lot of hopes and dreams, a lot of things that were successful. And it wasn't just the report that they provided. There's a lot of years of dedication and service and commitment to get to that point in time. But we just read the reports from folks, and that's all we tend to be able to cover within an hour. But each of these people has a rich history that they've provided to the field, including the episode on mindfulness. And Dana and her colleague, I'm blanking on her name now, the two of them provided a kind of a history of the field of mindfulness and where it's at today and what they've been able to do. But I think it is the Afghanistan/Bangladesh episode that, for me, was the most impactful. And I'll give you about 6 or 7 reasons why that's the case. I think that the young, compared to me and Punya and Chris, the young people that we had in this episode were very meta-reflective on where they are in this space and time, of what they've experienced and what they're doing now and what they can do. They're very proactive and not just reactive. They're taking a stance. They're saying, here's what I can do. Here are people back in my country in Afghanistan that need supports. The international community needs to, provide some infrastructure and resources and so forth. In part, they were paying back to society for being able to escape the situations that they're all facing in Afghanistan and get to Bangladesh. So proactive, meta-reflective, impactful. All these people were making an impact in some way. And as they were talking about the implications beyond themselves to the next generation or to the young people who aren't getting the same opportunities to go to the ASU or to go to Bangladesh or wherever, what happens to those that are left behind? But the other thing that maybe we forget or leave out was the fact that the founder of the Pakistan or the Bangladesh program, Asian University for Women, was not there. He was not there because he was in the midst of escaping a street fire below one of his campus buildings, and so he didn't make it to the episode. And all the people that were there were gender-wise were females, and it was really impactful show in some ways because we did not have a male in the show. We had future women leaders who were talking about what they've experienced and accomplished and so forth. It would have been great to have Kamal on the show, no doubt, but in part, it was kind of beneficial to have someone who just recently got a degree and is taking a leadership role within the Asian University for Women talk about that. She's a teaching fellow, I guess. So that's a couple of reflections that I have on the different episodes. Punya or Chris, you want to comment on that?
So if I can, I felt that in the mindfulness episode, as I was listening to it, I feel like I wish I had been there for that, because I think I could have been a little bit of a translator, because I think that there was sort of like Zhao was trying to make a point, which I don't think really the student by the way was Natalie Gruber, and Dana fully got, and I think so that sort of went a little bit at cross purposes, because I think Zhao's point was a very important one, which is that when we take these initiatives, and because I think there is some evidence that Dana and Natalie have in my conversations with them, where once you start trying to scale something like mindfulness, even with the best of intentions and design and thought, that once they go beyond one school, which was the school that they talked about where Hanafin was the principal, when it went district wide, they're seeing a huge difference in its implementation, because Hanafin truly believed in it. He brought his staff along gradually in that process. And so they're seeing a lot of positive effects. Now, when they're going to other schools where it is seen as something being brought by the district administration, you are not necessarily seeing the same buy-in from the teachers, and they're seeing, so I think Zhao was bringing up a very important point, and I think that they just never really sort of understood each other clearly. I wish that's what I was like. I wish I could have been there, because in my conversation with them, because to me, those are really powerful sort of barriers in the way of, like when we talk about scaling up of the originality of the vision and how that tweaks and changes and what happens in that process, what is gained and what is lost through that process maybe. So anyway, that was just a comment on that episode that I wanted to, because I know both sides. So I know exactly where they are coming from. And I could also see where the misalignment sort of happened there. And I was like, oh, dang, I was driving, and I was thinking, oh, I wish I was there to sort of mediate, because I think there was an interesting point that could have emerged in that discussion, which I think didn't really happen.
So Chris is going to jump in, I think.
Well, I also was very moved by the Afghan Bangladesh episode. And there's 2 points I want to make about it. One of them is that throughout Silver Lining for Learning, one of the things that we're proud of is that we have found these wonderful leaders, champions of innovation, people who persevered despite enormous odds, who are inspirations to all of us to never give up, never turn back, keep the faith, and so on. And this was yet another example of that. But the other thing that I wish we had gone more deeply into is a point that I brought up near the end, which is, what was it like to be in a university with women from all these different countries, like 19 different countries? And what they briefly described was in sharp contrast to the kind of tribalism that we frequently see when people from different countries are brought together in a variety of settings. So they said, oh, we room with each other. We have days where we wear our native clothing and, celebrate our native traditions, and everyone celebrates the other's native traditions. We have lots of holidays because, some country always has a holiday on any particular day that you can celebrate, and so on and so on. And some of that may have been because it's a women's university. I don't know that the story would have been the same if this had been co-ed or this had been a male university. But I thought that was a very interesting model. and would have liked to hear more about it, because we're desperately trying to find ways at scale that we can get even people that share the same language, share the same ethnicity, share the same religion even, are still at each other's throats because of perceived differences between them. And it would be great if we could get past that.
And I do think, Chris, you asked I think you did bring this up, but I don't think we went into as much depth as you wanted. But one of the things that really sort of stayed up with me also was that each of these individuals in some way is, I don't know even how to describe it. And that sort of really haunted me for a long time, that these changes that we're seeing in the world around us, these global conflicts and so on, these are the detritus of that global conflict, right? I mean, these are individuals whose lives have been just destroyed because of decisions taken by a few, usually men sitting somewhere saying we need to go to war over here or do this over there. And that was actually, when you think about it, the number of people whose lives are displaced, marginalized, disturbed, changed, harmed. That also sort of brought home to me that fact that, that as a nation, we are partially responsible for that, or maybe quite significantly responsible for what these women are going through, and so on. And there are so many more who didn't make it out to Chittagong, right? I mean, who are still there. And that was also the other thing that was haunting about each one of them, speaking about wanting to, like Kurt, you said that there was this sort of a commitment and a mission to give back at a scale in a way that to others who did not have these opportunities maybe. But again, I mean, just this description of like, you have to go to a second country where the male partner can then leave, and then you can get a visa to go to this country. I mean, these roadblocks that we have built, the sort of conversations we have about immigration and movement and travel and marginalizing people and so on, I mean, really brought home a lot of that as well, in a sort of that in their individual stories, the larger global narratives that sort of disrupt our lives in so many ways.
If we were to do a book of 40 chapters, let's say, of most impactful shows, and have the people write the individual chapter about life change in effect, or new educational models, or important educational models to consider, I think this would be one of the 40, that we would, from the 130 shows that we've had, that we would pick. And I had thought about that all along. Every week I'm thinking about, if I was to do a book, I'm not planning to do one, but if I had time to do one, which of these shows would I pick? And I'm thinking about each show, maybe later on, but not right now. Have either of you thought about that? Having people talk, write or us writing little summaries of the key episodes of all the 140 or so, or eventually 200?
Well, I think some of that will come out bottom up when we have podcasts of everything. Because if we have rich commentary by listeners on the podcasts, that bottom up, we're going to see certain episodes generate much more commentary than others, and maybe a commentary that has strong themes embedded in it that may mirror some of the themes that we had identified as hosts, or they may identify new themes that we didn't get to. So I think that this is a chance to have kind of an annotated bottom-up version that would be different than the book, but maybe richer than the book in terms of some of the perspectives that we might see. But let me bring up a different theme, more future-oriented. I'm in a different place than I was several months ago. Several months ago, I said to myself, we are not past the pandemic. The cold weather is coming, the holidays are coming, there's going to be a lot of travel, there's new variants lurking out there. There's a lot of reasons to feel that we're going to be going back several steps before we can go forward again. That hasn't really materialized as yet. Now, I'm not saying I know the future and now the pandemic is an endemic and we don't have to think about it as a pandemic anymore. But I will say that the last couple months, even with what happened in China, has been more positive than the darker models and the darker visions would have predicted. And so what does that say for silver lining for learning? Let's say that we are optimistically moving into a pandemic as endemic world where, yes, we still will have a dangerous new disease with us that's going to require certain kinds of precautions we didn't take before, and that's going to kill, older people in particular, more than they would have before the pandemic. But it's not going to be what it was. And so that kind of disruption in education isn't going to be what it was. What role do we want to think about for ourselves? Is it sort of more of the same, but now just reflecting on a more stable context? Is it shifting to pick up a different set of themes and issues? I don't have an answer, but I do have a sense that we're coming to kind of a watershed in the factors that started the program and that characterized a lot of it for the first couple of years, at least for now, seem to have receded somewhat.
So I've been sort of thinking about this, but I think that we've sort of, my table, I pushed a button and it decided to squeeze down on me. Sorry about that. This is the problem with automation. Okay, good. I survived that scare. I think we have sort of made a shift, and I credit Chris with you. And I remember at the AACTE saying that the smartest move really was not calling it pandemic ponderings, but rather calling it silver lining for learning, because what it does is it always had the positive bent, but it also meant that when the pandemic changed in character, whether it's endemic or whatever it may be. And I see our many of our episodes, I think just a very few episodes in the recent past, maybe the one with the higher ed, sort of focused on the impact of the pandemic, but has really been about showcasing interesting educational experiments globally, bringing new visions or old visions in new forms, whether it's around experiential learning and so on, designing learning experiences. To the foreground. And to me, that is a valuable service that doesn't go away. Plus it's the pleasure of hanging out with all of you on Saturdays, and also the guests that we bring in. I mean, every time it's different. I think that, so to me, I don't necessarily, I sort of get what you're saying, but I don't necessarily see, I think we have sort of made that pivot a little while ago. And one of the things we might think about, we did the thematic, sessions around India, for instance, where we had 4 episodes pretty close to each other, which allow us to get sort of a different look at what's going on. That might be one way of going forward, but I feel that we are still doing an amazing, sort of service, if to nobody as well, selfishly to ourselves, in getting to meet some really interesting people. Giving them a platform, I think that's important. I think people come here because they believe that these conversations are valuable in spreading the word about what they're doing, particularly those in the global South. I think really it is very meaningful to them. I think that we have sort of the right mix here so that's pretty much it. I don't know, Kurt, what your thoughts are.
Similar. I think we could look for themes like we do with the India, the 4 episodes we had last week's episode with the people from Afghanistan and Bangladesh. Could we have one on Ukraine and maybe a couple on other kind of refugee shows, if you will? I have a contact in Ukraine. I told her we're going to delay a bit. She had just become a partner with Indiana University, and so I knew she had a lot to do at the time, so I didn't want to push her right then and there. But we'll talk about what's happening in terms of online education, K-12 education in Ukraine, which maybe we could have a couple of shows on Ukraine. But maybe, the situation in Turkey and Syria. I have many contacts in Turkey, not as many in Syria. And we all probably have somebody in Turkey we could reach out to and find out what is going on there. Again, we don't want to push it right now. maybe we do something in Turkey 4 or 5 months from now, let it wait and see what passes, or even maybe 6 months wait on that. But it might be time to do the Ukraine show. It's a 1-year anniversary. Well, go ahead.
With Afghanistan, we have a strong Afghanistan cohort here at ASU, and the minister of Afghanistan, the former education minister of Afghanistan, is here. And I have her contact information, and I'm just waiting to get in touch with them to do an episode on that, because we just did one now. We had discussed that we might want to give it a gap, but that's one for sure that I would love to get up, because particularly getting the former minister of education on the show would be very powerful.
We had a master's. That show, and we've at Indiana had a master's with Afghan education leaders, or an institute anyhow. I think it was a master's and an institute, and I had them in my class several times. And if we could find out what they're doing now, if I could contact the person who's in charge of the Afghan program and maybe get those education leaders on to get an update as to what's happening, that might be a potential really interesting show. So one with ASU initiative, one with the Indiana initiative, potentially. Chris, you look like you're going to jump in here.
Well, another question that I have in my mind as we think about this is, sometimes we have episodes that are more directed to the field of ed tech and that are more directed towards the process in the field. So I would highlight the show with Mark Milliron as talking about a different way of thinking about design. I'm one of the leaders in engineering learning, and I can imagine a show where we could get a couple of the people who co-edited the Learning Engineering Toolkit that came out last year, and then I and Bror Saxberg could talk about the earlier learning engineering book that we co-edited with a colleague of mine. But that's a more academic program. I mean, now when you talk about engineering learning, you start to get into big data and analytics and subjects that are more narrow and more deep, probably, than the typical show that we've been doing in the past. Maybe somewhat more overlap with what one might find at more research-oriented conference sessions. And I don't know whether it makes sense to go that direction or not. Part of me wants to do it to say to people in the field, this is what's coming. But part of me wants to say, but other folks are doing that, and we're doing something that nobody else seems to be doing. So I don't know. I'm going back and forth on that.
So Chris, I think that, and I agree. I think initially when we started off an episode which is much more academic in nature, research-oriented nature, I would not have seen those as being a good fit, honestly. But I do think that if we set some guardrails up with our guests, saying that our audience is very wide, and so if we can speak to some broader themes that would, it's almost like, people who do popularization of science, right? I mean, you don't dumb down the ideas, but you try to minimize the jargon to make the ideas more accessible. I think that's a perfectly valid way of thinking about it, and could actually be a contribution in the sense of taking some of the conversations that are happening at a more academic level, but make it more accessible to a wider audience. And that's a worthwhile thing to do. And I think that the episode that we've been thinking about with, let's say, Ariel Anbar and Norm Baer could be one of those, where these are hardcore academics, but are trying to do some interesting work and in the field, but maybe it's not penetrated everywhere as it needs to. And this is a part of the translation, or at least the communication or dissemination of those ideas.
I just got my alumni magazine from Wisconsin, Learning Connections, and in there was an article about Erica Helverson, who's Rich Helverson's wife. And she's got a new podcast called Art Educators Save the World. And the first show they highlighted was her first guest was Lin-Manuel Miranda. And so question from that is, do we need to have a once a year, try to get somebody, a big name in education field as a kind of a kickoff for the new year? I don't know. I don't think we need to, but I just wanted to raise that since they seem to find that to be worth highlighting anyhow. And we might get some attention within, our podcast series, having one or two leading figures, different points in the year. Again, I don't necessarily think we need to, but I wouldn't say no if someone knew of someone of that status, maybe Rich Collada from ISTE, who used to be the head of education department ed tech. We had him on an episode. I mean, he's not as famous as Lin-Manuel Miranda, but I guess there aren't many people who are, but maybe we could get Arnie Duncan on the show. That might be interesting to have. Someone like that.
Let me shift gears again and say this can fall under the thinking out loud part of SLL. What is our thinking about celebrating year 3? Because that's now about a month out, right, or less than a month out.
Right. So, firstly, Chris, I am the person who just is out loud. There is not much thinking. So thank you for adding that. No, I'm glad you brought that up, because I was actually looking at the time and saying that we need to talk a little bit about that. So tentatively, what I think we had planned was, I'm looking at the schedule here, is that the March 18th episode, to bring in the team who have been working on the podcast. These are all former students of yours. There are 3 or 4 of them. They are spread out all over the world. I was in a Zoom meeting with them recently, a week or 2 ago. I think a week ago, Sunday. Yeah. And I mentioned to them that we would love to have them as guests on the show. The only thing is finding the right time that would work for, people in Singapore and Mumbai and Texas and, and of course, Boston and Indiana and Eugene and Phoenix, right? So I think it might have to be at a special time to accommodate them, which I think is fine. But I think it's 2 things. One is, I am so impressed by this team. I mean, they get nothing for it. Working in the background, they've gone through each and every episode, creating the content that would go on the podcast, and then we would be able to publish the podcast pretty, smoothly, to put the content in, and have all our episodes, all 140 plus, available on Stitcher and Spotify and Apple and so on. So that's, I think, an important piece to recognize them. But also, since they have been listening to the episodes or reading the content, they will have ideas about things that have stood out for them, which to me, who else apart from us? And again, I've forgotten a bunch of the episodes because it's been 3 years and I'm older now than I was before. But it'll be more recent for them. So I thought that was one way of both acknowledging them, announcing that the podcast is coming, as well as getting their thoughts on all the episodes. And then the other idea that Kurt had was to go back to some of our older guests and bring them back for the episode after that one. So that's what we have right now.
The second one, we could pose Chris's question. How do we change kind of the mechanism or the mission of Silver Lining for Learning? We could each bring one guest back and have them talk about what should we do now? We're 3 years later in a post-pandemic world, and seeing what their views and what, in effect, having those 4 people serve as a mini advisory board to us, and maybe have them talk about what's going on in their respective worlds today.
It might be cool to get Sugata Mitra back. He was our first guest.
How about you invite Sugata back? I think I might invite the woman from Los Angeles School District who Rich Collada had suggested. She's just won a bunch of awards. Sophia Mendoza. Yeah. I think she would be good. So that'd be two. If Chris could get one and Young could get one.
Yeah, I think there's a couple. Last year, as I recall, we did bring back people from the first 2 years, and that worked well because we could say, Uruguay, we brought back Leandro Folger from Uruguay, and we said, we had you on right when the pandemic was starting. Where is Uruguay now? How have things changed? And that was interesting. I think we could cherry pick in some of the earlier episodes and say that, do now and then kinds of comparisons. But the other thing to do would be to do something that would be more future oriented. And again, pick from guests that maybe are representative of different views of the field that we're in, and say, where would you like to see EdTech 5 years from now? What jobs would people have when they graduated? What would be taught? What would the degrees be called 5 years from now if we really harvest many of the interesting possibilities that are emerging today? That could be interesting too, as a kind of a capstone.
Yeah, I agree. And whether we have that as 2 different weeks or 1 week, whichever, I can go either way.
So I can reach out to the podcast team for sure and try to work on that because I'm in touch with them. So that reminds me of one more thing. The 4 of us need to get together and record an introduction to the podcast, which will be sort of our 0th episode. Because I have to send that through and get approval from Apple. So the main thing is there are 3 main gatekeepers in this situation. So the Apple, Spotify, and Google. So they need something. They usually take 72 hours, up to 72 hours to approve it. And once that's approved, then nobody's checking. We can put all our episodes in and so on. But for that 0th episode, I think it'll be great to have the 4 of us together, just saying, hey, we want to welcome you to this new version of Silver Lining for Learning. It'll be a podcast. We can just chit chat a little bit, nothing more than 15 minutes. I can then clean that up and put it on the Simplecast website and then get it approved through Apple and Google. And then all our episodes, we can start pumping them in because I have the MP3s for all of them. These, kids have been kids. Yeah, they are kids, I guess. I've been working on the, the pros and all that goes in that Simplecast needs. So we should be good with that. So maybe next week, either before or after, we can spend a few minutes just sort of chit-chatting about the program overall and that it's coming in podcast form. That would make episode like the intro episode to the podcast.
I thought you were going to say we get the 4 of us together and we're going to have to sing harmony, but well. So that's one show, and then I think Chris is right. Have the other show be the future of education 5 years out. But when we start the show, just give us an update on where they are today. Don't just jump right in. At least we give us a sense of what the state of the world in their mind is today, and then project out to the future for most of the show. I think that would be real good.
Another interesting thing that we can talk about sometime would be, once we have the podcasts, do we want to associate micro-credentials with them? So for example, with 141 episodes, we could say, watch these 6 and you'll get a micro-credential on making in its many forms, from fan fiction to maker spaces to whatever. Watch these 7 and you can get a credential on educational innovation in South Asia. Whatever. I mean, it wouldn't be that hard to do. I don't know whether people would want the micro credentials or not. We could make them NFTs with the 4 of us, on the cover. Try to do better than Trump did with our NFTs. But
he did very well.
he did very well. The people that bought them didn't do so well.
Yeah, I know, exactly. He did just fine. Thank you.
But I do think I think, we've talked about people could mine these to use in courses, but without trying to set up courses ourselves or assessment systems, we could, offer a kind of document that you've watched this subset, and we'll give you a micro-credential that reflects the kinds of insights we think it represents.
Sounds good. We're just about out of time today. We've got just a couple of minutes left before we need to introduce the next show. Does anyone have a pressing issue to raise or a summative note for this episode 141?
No, I just think that the last 5 episodes in their own way capture the richness of Silver Lining for Learning. More than anything else. I mean, you asked in the beginning, like, what's common to them? I think what's common to them is a diversity of approaches towards solving sort of really important educational problems, addressing them, right? So I think that's what's really common to them, is that how unique and different they are, but yet they're connected by a caring for learning and education and, and so on.
And I agree that we've upped our game over time in here. During the first year, I must admit, there were times where I was just like, who can we get? We got a lot of openings out there. Now, when I'm reading something, in a couple months or 3 months, maybe we could get them on, I'm not thinking about next week or, the coming month. It's really thinking a little further out with the episodes that we have. It's more of a, slick production today. And we've all gained some expertise. Chris?
Well, I just think that we should celebrate the fact that we're not a set of webinars and we're not a set of panels, which we could be, which would be more standard for this kind of series of presentations. Because as co-hosts, we really are the connective tissue that takes things that appear different on the surface, and through our memories and through playing off one another, we weave together how the episodes build on one another in a way that the whole is more than the sum of the parts. So I think the fact that it is a conversation and that the discussants are stable over time is part of the secret sauce for Silver Lining for Learning.
And Punya, then you'll organize the first anniversary episode, in effect, and I'll try and organize the second one. I'll send an email to Young, Chris, and you about bringing in a guest to talk, prior guest, talk about the future and so forth. So we need to introduce the next episode very quickly. It is called Through the Staff. We have Young who have had limited opportunities to learn a musical instrument or learn about music in general, and have created a global community of practice of music educators who provide mentoring services online to young people who don't have access to them normally to learn how to play violin or piano or whatever. This could be a really interesting show. It'll be at our normal time next week, Saturday at 5:30 p.m. Eastern, episode 142, Through the Staff. I hope you can come join us then. Thanks a lot.